The blade was already moving before anyone in that grand hall noticed it. I saw it first because I was trained to see it, not because I was special, not because I was chosen, but because for 6 years my job had been to notice the one wrong movement in a crowd of 1,000 right ones. My name is Daniel Hart, and on the day the alien princess rejected the human alliance in front of the entire galactic concord, I was standing in the back of the room, holding a rifle I was told I would never need to use. The princess stood on a raised platform of dark glass, her long silver robes catching the light from 100 floating lanterns. Her name was Sel Vaughn, heir to the FaSci Dominion, a civilization older than human writing, older than human fire. She was speaking to the council, and her words were sharp enough to cut steel. "Humanity is not ready," she said, her voice calm but merciless. "They are a species built on conflict. They solve their problems with fists and weapons, not with wisdom. I will not bind my people's future to theirs." The human ambassador beside me, a tired man named Gerald Finch, flinched like he had been struck. Around the chamber, delegates from a dozen alien worlds shifted uncomfortably. This was supposed to be the day humanity finally joined the Concord as equals. Instead, it was becoming the day we were publicly humiliated in front of the galaxy. I was not supposed to feel anything about it. I was there to stand still and look intimidating in my dress uniform. But something about the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, made my jaw tighten. Then I saw the movement. A member of her own court, a tall figure wrapped in ceremonial armor the color of dried blood, shifted his hand toward his sleeve. It was small. It was quick. Anyone not trained to watch for exactly that kind of motion would have missed it entirely. But I had spent years learning to read a body before it acted, and every instinct I had screamed that something terrible was about to happen. The hidden blade came free in less than a second, thin and curved, glinting under the lantern light as it shot toward the platform where the princess stood with her back half-turned. I did not think. I did not calculate the political consequences of a human soldier breaking protocol in front of the entire galaxy. I simply moved. My boots hit the polished floor hard as I crossed the distance between the wall and the platform faster than anyone in that hall believed a person could move. Alien guards turned too slowly, their reflexes trained for a world where such treachery did not exist among their own kind. The princess's personal guards were reaching for weapons that would arrive far too late. I reached her first. I grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her down and to the side, putting my own body between her and the blade. I felt a sharp line of heat cut across my upper arm as the weapon that was meant for her throat found me instead. It was not deep, it was not fatal, but it burned like fire, and blood began soaking through my sleeve almost instantly. The hall exploded into chaos. Alarms shrieked in a language of light and sound I did not understand. Guards swarmed the man who had thrown the blade, and within seconds he was pinned to the floor, his ceremonial mask torn away to reveal a face twisted with fury and something that looked almost like grief. The princess stared up at me from where I had pulled her down, her golden eyes wide, with something I had never expected to see in them. Not gratitude, not fear, shock. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that?" I helped her to her feet, keeping my body angled to shield her, even though the immediate danger had passed. My arm throbbed, but I kept my voice steady. "Because it was the right thing to do," I said simply. She looked at me like I had spoken a language she did not recognize, even though the translation device on her collar had rendered my words perfectly into her own tongue. Around us, her guards were shouting questions at the captured attacker, demanding to know who had sent him, why he had tried to kill the heir of the Dominion during a Concord ceremony of all places. I found out later that the attacker was a member of a faction within her own court who believed that any alliance with outside species, especially humanity, would weaken the purity of FaSci rule. He had decided that if the princess would not be convinced to reject the alliance strongly enough on her own, he would create a crisis that made rejection unavoidable. He wanted to make it look as though a human had killed her and blame our entire species for the act. Instead, a human had saved her life. The chamber medics arrived to look at my arm, but I waved them off long enough to make sure the princess was truly unharmed. She stood very still, watching me with an expression I could not read. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were solving some difficult equation. "You bleed easily," she said finally, glancing at the red soaking through my sleeve. "For a species that prides itself on strength." "Strength isn't about not getting hurt," I said. "It's about what you're willing to get hurt for." Something flickered behind her eyes at that. She did not respond. Instead, she turned to her guards and issued a series of sharp commands in her own language, ordering the attacker taken away and the chamber secured. Then she looked back at me one more time before allowing her own healers to guide her from the platform. The Concord Council convened an emergency session an hour later. I sat outside the chamber with a fresh bandage on my arm, listening through the thin wall as delegates argued about what had just happened. Some believed the attack proved exactly what the princess had said, that violence followed humanity wherever we went. Others argued the opposite, that a human soldier had just risked his own life to save the very woman who had condemned our entire species minutes before. Ambassador Finch found me sitting there, his face pale with exhaustion. "You do understand," he said quietly, "that you may have just saved this alliance, or destroyed it completely. Nobody knows yet which one it will turn out to be." "I didn't do it for the alliance," I told him honestly. "I did it because someone was about to die, and I could stop it." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his tired face. "That," he said, "might be exactly why it matters." Before he could say more, the doors to the council chamber opened, and a FaSci attendant approached us both with quick, precise steps. She stopped in front of me and bowed slightly, a gesture I had learned was rare and reserved for those the Dominion considered worthy of respect. "Princess Selvan requests your presence," the attendant said. "Immediately." Ambassador Finch's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded for me to go. I followed the attendant down a corridor lined with strange, glowing patterns that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, until we reached a private chamber where the princess stood alone, staring out through a window at the stars beyond. She did not turn around right away. "Do you know why I rejected the alliance today?" she asked, her voice quiet now, stripped of the sharp authority she had used in the council hall. "I have some ideas," I said carefully. "But I imagine you're about to tell me the real reason." She turned then, and for the first time I saw something beneath the icy composure she wore like armor, something that looked almost like exhaustion, almost like pain. "My people bond through thought," she said. "We share our minds with each other constantly, from the moment we are born until the moment we die. We are never truly alone. It is how we know love, how we know loyalty, how we know truth. But you," she paused, studying me with those golden eyes, "you are silent to me, completely silent. I cannot feel your intentions the way I feel everyone else's, and when that blade came for me today, I could not sense the danger the way I usually would have. It was you who saw it, not my own guards, not my own bonded court, a silent stranger from a silent species." "Does that scare you?" I asked. "It should," she said, "but it does not, and that troubles me more than anything else that happened today." Outside the chamber, alarms had finally quieted, and the corridors of the Concord station had returned to their usual calm hum of distant voices and machinery. But standing there in that quiet room, bandaged arm still aching, I understood that something far larger than a diplomatic ceremony had just begun. The princess who had rejected an entire species in front of the galaxy was now looking at one member of that species like he was the only person in the universe she could not predict. And I had a feeling, standing there in the glow of alien starlight, that this was only the beginning of a much longer and far more dangerous story. The council decided, against the objections of half the delegates in that station, that I would be assigned as the personal guard of Princess Selvan for the remainder of the ratification talks. It was framed as an honor. It felt more like a sentence neither of us had asked for. "You wish to study us," Ambassador Finch had told her during the negotiations, choosing his words with obvious care. "Then study the one man who has already proven himself useful to your safety." She had agreed, though I later learned it was not because of his argument. It was because she wanted answers to questions she could not stop asking herself, and she believed I was the only person capable of giving them to her honestly. My new quarters were inside the Dominion section of the station, a wing built from smooth, curved walls that shifted color depending on the mood of whoever stood nearest them. I found this deeply unsettling the first night, watching the walls of my room shift from pale blue to a nervous shade of gray as I tried to sleep. Apparently, my restlessness was visible to anyone who cared to look. The princess found this fact amusing. "Your walls betray you," she said the next morning, meeting me in a corridor connecting our quarters. "You were anxious all night." "I was in enemy territory," I said, "or what used to be enemy territory, before we all decided we weren't enemies anymore, allegedly." She almost smiled. Almost. I was learning that with her, almost was a significant victory. Our days together settled into a strange rhythm neither of us fully understood. She would attend council sessions, argue economic terms and boundaries and agreements with visiting delegates from a dozen worlds, and I would stand nearby, watching for threats that mostly never came. In the evenings, she would ask me questions. "Why did you become a soldier?" she asked one night, as we walked along an observation deck overlooking a slow-spinning nebula. "Where I come from, not everyone has a choice about that," I told her. "I grew up in a part of the world where opportunities were thin and the recruiters were generous with promises. I wanted to protect something bigger than myself, a family, a future, something." "And did you find it? The thing bigger than yourself?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering. Some days, other days, I just found more reasons to keep looking. She studied me, the way she often did, as though trying to translate something in my expression that her instincts, so finely tuned to her own species, simply could not decode. "My people would call that uncertainty a weakness," she said. "We are meant to know our purpose from birth, shared through the chorus, the bond that links every Vathari mind together. I have never had to wonder what I am for." "Must be nice," I said, though I meant it honestly rather than sarcastically. "Waking up every day already knowing your purpose." "It is not nice," she said quietly, surprising me. "It is loud, constantly. There has never been a single moment in my entire life where I was alone with only my own thoughts. Not one." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply let the silence sit between us. Something I had noticed she seemed to find strangely comforting rather than uncomfortable. Over the following days, I began showing her small things, not out of any grand strategy, but simply because they were part of who I was. When a young technician from a minor delegation was injured during an accident involving a malfunctioning door mechanism, I helped carry him to the medical bay myself, rather than waiting for the proper channels to be followed. When a defeated rival delegation, embarrassed after losing an important trade vote, was mocked openly by other alien representatives, I quietly intervened, not with force, but by simply standing beside them until the mockery stopped. She watched all of this from a distance, saying nothing, though I noticed she began carrying a small data device with her at all times, occasionally speaking notes into it when she thought I was not paying attention. "You are recording your observations of me," I said one evening, catching her in the act. She did not deny it. "I intended to use them as evidence, proof that humanity's supposed compassion is simply theater, a performance meant to win favor from species like mine who value cooperation." "And is that what you found? Theater?" She hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know before she even answered. "No," she admitted, "I have not been able to find the performance in it. I have looked very carefully, Daniel Hart." I cannot find where the acting ends and the truth begins. Hearing her say my full name for the first time, rather than simply calling me soldier or human, felt oddly significant, though I could not have said exactly why. One evening, while walking through a garden section of the station built to mimic FaSci flora, thin silver trees with leaves that chimed softly in artificial wind, she asked me something that caught me completely off guard. Have you ever taken a life? The question hung in the cool air between us. I considered lying, considered deflecting, but something about the honesty she had already shown me made deception feel wrong. Yes, I said simply, more than once. Does it haunt you? Every single time, I said. If it ever stopped haunting me, I think that would be the moment I truly became the danger your people believe humanity to be. She was quiet for a long time after that, walking slowly beside me beneath the chiming silver trees. My people do not take life easily either, she finally said. We simply believe we have found better ways to avoid the necessity of it. Diplomacy, consensus, the chorus, which allows us to feel what others feel and therefore understand before conflict becomes unavoidable. That sounds like a good system, I admitted. Better than anything we've built. It failed to protect my own mother, she said, and something in her voice cracked slightly, the first true fracture I had seen in her composed exterior. I did not push her to explain further that night. I simply let the silence hold us both. The chiming of the silver leaves, the only sound in that strange garden built to remind an alien princess of a home she rarely got to see. It was 2 nights later, during a private council recess, that she finally told me the whole story. We were sitting in a small observation room, just the two of us, the station's artificial gravity humming faintly beneath our feet. She had ordered her attendants away, an unusual request that I later learned had caused significant confusion among her staff. When I was young, she began, staring at the stars through the reinforced glass, there was an incident on the border colonies, a conflict, they called it. Human mercenaries, hired by a rival faction within the Concord, attacked a diplomatic transport. My mother was aboard that transport. My stomach tightened, already sensing where this was going. She did not survive, Selvan continued, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was saying. I was told, my entire life, that it was humanity's aggression that killed her. That your species could not be trusted, that given power and opportunity, you would always choose destruction over restraint. I'm sorry, I said quietly, because there was nothing else to say that would not sound hollow. I do not want your apology, she said, though not unkindly. I want the truth, and the truth is, I do not know if the story I was told is even accurate. It was investigated by factions within my own court who had reasons to want humanity blamed. I was a child. I believed what I was told because it was easier than doubting the people who raised me. Do you doubt it now? She turned to look at me, her golden eyes reflecting the distant starlight. I did not, until I met you, she said. You have shown me nothing but restraint, even when restraint cost you blood. You have shown me sacrifice, even when nobody demanded it of you. If humanity is truly the uncontrollable species I was taught to fear, then explain to me why the first human I have ever truly known behaves nothing like that description. I did not have a perfect answer for her. I only had the truth as I understood it. Maybe we're both, I said. Maybe humanity is capable of the worst you can imagine, and also capable of exactly what you've seen from me. Maybe that's what makes us complicated and worth trusting at the same time. We're not simple. We're not one thing. She considered this for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I had known her, she lowered something I could only describe as an invisible wall around herself. I felt no physical change, no telepathic sensation, since I could not share her correspond regardless. But I saw it in her posture, in the way her shoulders eased slightly, in the way she allowed herself, just for a moment, to look tired and uncertain in front of another living being. I have never done that before, she said quietly, almost to herself. Allowed myself to simply exist near someone without performing strength. You don't have to perform anything around me, I told her. I am beginning to understand that, she said, and it unsettles me more than any threat ever could. Neither of us spoke again for a long while after that, sitting together in comfortable silence beneath the slow wheeling stars, while somewhere deeper in the station, factions who did not want to see an alliance succeed were already beginning to notice the change taking place within their princess, and beginning to plan how they might stop it before it went any further. I woke to the sound of my door chime 3 hours before dawn cycle, a sharp electronic note that meant something urgent rather than routine. I was already reaching for the sidearm on my nightstand before I was fully awake, years of training taking over faster than conscious thought. It was Lyra, one of the princess's personal attendants, a young FaSci woman with pale blue markings along her cheekbones that deepened in color whenever she felt distress. Tonight, they were nearly black. "She needs you," Lyra said, her voice tight. "Something has happened in the lower archive levels. She would not let me summon her official guards. She asked only for you." I dressed quickly and followed her through corridors that had gone eerily quiet, the usual hum of station traffic reduced to nothing at this hour. We descended through several levels I had never been permitted to visit before, deep into a section of the Dominion wing reserved for historical records and diplomatic archives. I found Selvan standing alone in a vast chamber filled with floating data crystals, each one glowing faintly with stored information stretching back centuries. She was staring at one particular crystal held in her open palm, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I could not sleep," she said, without turning to look at me. "I came here instead. I wanted to find the original investigation records from the incident that killed my mother. I have never actually looked at them myself. I only ever accepted what my regents told me as a child." "And did you find them?" She held up the crystal, its surface swirling with faint symbols I could not read. "Yes," she said. "It took considerable effort. These records were sealed under multiple layers of restricted access, far more heavily protected than a routine historical file should ever be." "That's suspicious on its own," I said, moving closer. "I thought so too," she said. "So I broke the seals anyway. I am the heir to this dominion. I decided I had every right to see the truth about my own mother's death, regardless of who wished to keep it hidden from me." She activated the crystal, and a shimmering image projected into the air between us, showing what appeared to be a tactical report from decades earlier. I could not read the alien script directly, but the translation overlay rendered the words into English for my benefit, likely a courtesy she had arranged in advance. The report was damning, but not in the way either of us had expected. The attack on the diplomatic transport carrying her mother had indeed involved human mercenaries. But the report clearly stated, in cold official language, that those mercenaries had been hired and directed by a faction within the FaSci court itself, a group who wanted to prevent the late Empress from signing an early cooperation agreement with the fledgling human colonies at the time. They had orchestrated the entire attack, using human hands as the visible weapon, while keeping their own involvement completely hidden. "They used us," I said quietly, understanding hitting me like a physical blow. "They needed humans to blame, so they hired humans to do the killing, knowing the story would spread exactly the way they wanted it to spread." "And it worked," Selvan said, her voice trembling now, with a fury I had never heard from her before. "For 20 years, I believed my mother died because of human violence. I built my entire understanding of your species around that lie. I rejected an alliance in front of the whole Concord because of a story invented by murderers within my own court who wished to hide their own guilt. Do you know who they were? The faction responsible?" She turned the crystal slightly, revealing a final section of the report, a list of names and house sigils belonging to those who had authorized the operation. Her expression darkened as she read them. "House Vel-Koresh," she said, "one of the oldest and most influential houses within the Dominion. They have opposed outside alliances for generations, believing that contact with lesser species, as they call them, dilutes the purity of FaSci civilization. If they discover that I have found this report, they will not allow me to live long enough to reveal it. The words had barely left her mouth when the chamber lights flickered once, then died entirely, plunging us into sudden darkness broken only by the faint glow of floating data crystals. "That is not a normal power fluctuation," she whispered. I already had my weapon raised, positioning myself between her and the chamber entrance. "Someone's cutting the systems deliberately," I said, "which means someone already knows we're down here." Emergency lighting flickered on a moment later, dim red strips along the floor that cast long shadows across the archive chamber. Through the entrance, I could hear the sound of multiple footsteps approaching with disciplined, coordinated movement. Not station security, something else. "How many exits does this chamber have?" I asked quietly. "Only the one we entered through," she said, her composure returning despite the danger, "and a maintenance shaft near the rear wall, though it has not been used in years and may not even be functional." "Then we're going to need to make a decision very quickly," I said, already scanning the chamber for anything useful. My eyes settled on a heavy support column near the entrance, thick metal reinforced with alien alloy, and beside it, a control panel for the chamber's internal security shutters. "Can you seal that entrance from here?" I asked, nodding toward the panel. "Yes, but it would trap us inside with them if they breach it regardless." "That's fine," I said. "I'd rather fight them in a narrow doorway, one at a time, than out in the open where they can surround us." She looked at me with something between disbelief and grudging respect. "You have already decided how this confrontation will unfold, before it has even begun." "That's the job," I said simply. "Seal the door. Buy me 30 seconds. She moved to the panel and began working the controls with quick, precise fingers while I positioned myself beside the support column, weapon ready, watching the entrance as heavy footsteps grew louder in the corridor beyond. The security shutter began sliding closed just as the first attacker reached the entrance, a FaSci soldier in dark, unmarked armor, clearly not affiliated with any official Dominion Guard unit. He tried to force his way through the narrowing gap, and I fired once, striking the joint of his weapon arm rather than a lethal target, dropping him instantly without ending his life. The shutter finished closing a heartbeat later, sealing us inside with a heavy metallic thud. "That will not hold them long," Selvan said, already moving toward the rear maintenance shaft she had mentioned earlier. Velkaresh soldiers carry cutting tools designed for exactly this situation. "Then we move now," I said, following her toward the narrow shaft entrance. The maintenance passage was cramped, barely wide enough for us to crawl through single file, filled with the dust of decades of disuse. Behind us, I could already hear the sound of cutting tools beginning to work against the sealed shutter, sparks visible through gaps in the archive chamber's darkened interior. "Where does this lead?" I asked, crawling close behind her through the tight metal passage. "Toward the lower engineering decks," she said. "If we can reach them, there will be enough station personnel present that a direct attack becomes far more difficult for them to attempt without witnesses." We moved as quickly as the cramped passage allowed, the sound of pursuit growing more distant behind us as the shaft twisted downward through several levels of the station's inner structure. My arm brushed against exposed wiring more than once, and somewhere behind us, I heard a distant metallic crash that suggested the shutter had finally given way. "They're through," I said. "Keep moving." We emerged 20 minutes later into a wide engineering deck filled with the comforting hum of active machinery and the presence of dozens of station workers going about their routine duties. Selvan straightened her robes and composed herself with remarkable speed, though I noticed her hands were still trembling slightly from the exertion of our escape. "We need to get this report to the Concord Council immediately," I said, "before Velkaresh can silence you, or destroy the evidence, or both." "It will not be that simple," she said. "House Velkaresh holds significant influence within the council itself. If we present this report through normal channels, they will have every opportunity to discredit it, to claim it was fabricated, to bury the truth entirely before it ever reaches a wider audience. Then we don't use normal channels, I said. We need someone the entire council trusts, someone with no stake in Dominion politics who can vouch for the authenticity of what we've found. She considered this for a long moment before her eyes brightened with sudden understanding. Ambassador Finch, she said, humanity has no history within FaSci internal politics. If he presents this evidence publicly, alongside my own testimony, House Vel-Koresh will have no credible way to dismiss it as fabrication. Then that's our next move, I said. But we need to reach him before Vel-Koresh realizes we've slipped past their assassins and figures out where we're headed. We made our way through the engineering deck toward the human diplomatic quarters, staying close to groups of station workers whenever possible, using the crowds as cover against any further attempts at pursuit. Selvan walked close beside me, her earlier composure returning with every step, though I could feel the tension radiating from her at the enormity of what we were about to attempt. 20 years, she said quietly as we walked. 20 years, I believed a lie that cost your people their reputation across half the galaxy. I owe you an apology, far greater than the one I have already given. You don't owe me anything, I said. You were a child who trusted the people who raised you. That's not a crime. What matters now is what you do with the truth, now that you finally have it. And what do I do with it? She asked, glancing at me with an expression that looked almost lost, despite the crown she carried and the authority she wielded. You use it to make things right, I said. Starting with telling the entire Concord exactly what really happened to your mother and exactly who has been hiding behind humanity's reputation for 2 decades. She nodded slowly, resolve hardening in her golden eyes. Then let us move quickly, she said, before Vel-Koresh finds a way to bury this truth as thoroughly as they buried it the first time. We reached the human diplomatic quarters 20 minutes later. Moving through back corridors, Selvan seemed to know intimately, likely memorized during years of formal visits she had never expected would one day serve as an escape route from her own people's treachery. Ambassador Finch answered his door still half asleep, but the moment he saw the data crystal in Selvan's hand and the urgency in both our expressions, his exhaustion vanished entirely. Tell me everything, he said, ushering us inside and sealing the door behind us. And tell me quickly. By the time the sun cycle brightened the station's artificial sky, several hours later, we had a plan in place. Fragile and dangerous, but a plan nonetheless. House Vel-Koresh believed their assassins had failed only temporarily, that they still had time to silence the princess before she could act. They did not yet know that the truth was already moving beyond their reach, carried by an alien princess and a human soldier who had, against every expectation held by either of their civilizations, become something neither of them had names for yet. But I understood, sitting in that quiet room as dawn approached, that whatever House Vel-Koresh planned next would not be subtle. They had already tried assassination once. Now that their greatest secret was at risk of exposure, they would not hesitate to attempt something far larger, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to survive. The attack came exactly 2 days later, faster and more coordinated than any of us had anticipated. Ambassador Finch had spent those 2 days quietly building support among neutral Concord delegates, showing carefully selected portions of the recovered evidence to representatives from species who held no particular loyalty to either House Vel-Koresh or the broader FaSci court. Selvan remained largely confined to secure quarters during this time, guarded not by her own official soldiers, whose loyalty could no longer be fully trusted, but by a small hand-picked group of station security personnel and myself. It was during a scheduled council session, one meant to be a routine discussion of trade tariffs between 3 minor systems, that House Vel-Koresh made their move. I noticed it first in the unusual number of Dominion soldiers stationed near the council chamber entrances, far more than protocol required for a session of this size. Something about their positioning felt wrong, too deliberate, too coordinated for simple ceremonial guard duty. "Something's off," I said quietly to Selvan as we approached the chamber alongside Ambassador Finch. "Too many soldiers, positioned too carefully. This isn't standard security." She scanned the corridor with narrowed eyes, her earlier confidence giving way to visible tension. "You are right," she said. "These are Vel-Koresh household soldiers, not official Dominion guards. They should not have authority to be present here at all." Before any of us could react further, the chamber's main doors slid shut with a heavy mechanical finality, sealing the majority of visiting delegates inside while cutting off the corridor where we stood from the main assembly. Alarms began sounding through the station's speaker systems, and the calm hum of routine council business exploded instantly into chaos. "They're attempting a coup," Selvan said, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "If they seal the council chamber and eliminate me before the evidence can be formally presented, they can claim I died in an unfortunate accident, or worse, blame the incident on human aggression once again, using it to permanently destroy any chance of alliance." "Then we don't let them finish what they started," I said, already scanning the corridor for defensible positions and available exits. The Vel-Koresh soldiers advanced toward us with disciplined, coordinated movement, clearly prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. I counted at least 8 of them visible in the corridor, likely more positioned elsewhere throughout the station. "This corridor branches toward the observation deck up ahead," Selvan said quickly, pointing toward a side passage. "It is narrow enough to limit how many can approach at once, and it connects eventually to the main assembly hall through a secondary entrance most soldiers would not expect us to use." "Then that's our route," I said. "Finch, stay behind us, and stay low." We moved quickly down the narrow side passage, the sound of pursuing soldiers echoing behind us through the station's metal corridors. I positioned myself at the rear of our small group, using every piece of architectural cover the passage provided to slow our pursuers without engaging them directly whenever possible, preferring to disable rather than destroy wherever the opportunity allowed. At a junction where the passage narrowed to barely 2 meters wide, I stopped and turned to face the soldiers now closing the distance behind us. "Keep moving," I told Selvan and Ambassador Finch. "I'll hold them here. This choke point only allows 1 or 2 through at a time." "I will not leave you to face them alone," Selvan said firmly, planting her feet despite the danger. "You have to," I said. "You're the only one who can present that evidence to the council. If they catch you here, everything we've done means nothing. I can handle this. Go." She hesitated only a moment longer before nodding sharply and pulling Ambassador Finch forward down the passage toward the secondary entrance she had described. I turned back to face the approaching soldiers, drawing on every year of training I had ever received, using the narrow choke point to my advantage as the first soldiers reached me. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, conducted in tight quarters where numbers meant far less than positioning and precision. I disabled the first 2 soldiers using the confined space itself as a weapon, redirecting their own momentum against the corridor walls rather than meeting their strength directly. A third soldier managed to land a solid strike across my ribs before I countered, dropping him with a controlled blow that ended the confrontation without ending his life. But there were more coming, and I felt my strength beginning to falter under the accumulated damage of the fight, a sharp pain blooming across my side that suggested at least 1 cracked rib beneath the bruising. I heard Selvan's voice suddenly, not through the corridor, but somehow inside my own mind, faint and strained, as though she were pushing against some barrier that had never existed between us before. "Daniel, hold on. I am attempting something I have never attempted with a mind outside the chorus. Please, hold on just a little longer." I did not fully understand what was happening, but I felt something shift in the air around me, a strange pressure building at the edges of my awareness. Moments later, additional station security personnel arrived at the junction, alerted somehow to the exact location of the confrontation, despite the chaos consuming the rest of the station. "She warned you," one of the arriving officers said, glancing at me with confusion. Through some kind of emergency broadcast none of us have ever seen her use, she said the location, the danger, everything, directly into every guard's communication device, simultaneously. I did not have time to process the significance of what that meant, not yet, as the combined force of myself and the newly arrived security personnel finally overwhelmed the remaining Vel-Koresh soldiers, subduing them without further serious injury on either side. I found Selvan and Ambassador Finch moments later near the secondary entrance to the main assembly hall, both safe, both shaken but unharmed. Selvan's expression shifted from tense concentration to visible relief the moment she saw me approaching, favoring my injured side, but very much alive. "You broke your own laws," I said, understanding beginning to dawn as I recalled her strange voice inside my mind moments before. The chorus bond. You used it to warn guards who aren't part of your own household, guards you have no traditional bond with. "I did," she said simply. FaSci law forbids extending the chorus beyond established bonds without formal ceremony and consent from all parties involved. I broke that law without hesitation because the alternative was allowing you to face death alone in a corridor while I hid safely elsewhere. "That will have consequences," Ambassador Finch said quietly. "Then I will accept them," Selvan said, her voice carrying a new firmness I had not heard from her before. "I am done allowing tradition and fear to dictate choices that should be guided by what is simply right. Now let us finish what we came here to do." The remaining Vel-Koresh soldiers throughout the station were subdued within the hour, their coup attempt collapsing entirely once it became clear their coordinated assault had failed to achieve its central goal. House Vel-Koresh's leadership, realizing the extent of their exposure, attempted to flee the station entirely, only to be intercepted by loyal Dominion forces who had remained uninvolved in the conspiracy and were horrified to learn of their fellow nobles' treachery. Selvan addressed the reconvened council chamber later that same day, her voice steady despite the bruises and exhaustion visible beneath her composed exterior. She presented the recovered evidence in full, explaining the true circumstances of her mother's death, the decades-long deception perpetrated by House Vel-Koresh, and the failed coup attempt that had just concluded within the station's own corridors. The chamber remained utterly silent throughout her testimony, delegates from a dozen worlds listening with expressions ranging from shock to quiet vindication for a species that had endured decades of unfair suspicion, based entirely on a lie. When she finished speaking, she turned toward where I stood near the chamber entrance, my side still aching from the earlier confrontation, and addressed the assembled council directly. "I stand before you today," she said, "prepared to correct an error I made in front of this very council only weeks ago. I once said humanity was unready for alliance, that your species solved every problem through violence rather than wisdom. I was wrong, and I was manipulated into being wrong by those within my own house who profited from that lie." She paused, her golden eyes finding mine across the crowded chamber. "I have witnessed restraint from this species when violence would have been easier. I have witnessed sacrifice when self-preservation would have been simpler. I have witnessed a soldier bleed for a stranger's safety, and later risk his own life again without hesitation, asking nothing in return beyond the truth being finally told. If this is what humanity truly is, then I was not simply mistaken about your species. I was mistaken about the very nature of strength itself." The chamber erupted into a mixture of murmured conversation and cautious applause, delegates exchanging glances that suggested the political landscape of the entire Concord had just shifted dramatically in the span of a single testimony. But even as celebration began to spread through the assembly, I understood that the true consequences of everything that had happened, both the exposed conspiracy and whatever had grown between Selvan and myself over these past difficult weeks, were only just beginning to unfold. The days following the collapse of House Vel-Koresh's conspiracy moved faster than I could fully track, a blur of formal hearings, council sessions, and diplomatic maneuvering that consumed nearly every waking hour for both Selvan and myself. House Vel Karesh's remaining leadership faced formal judgment before the Dominion's highest court, their titles stripped, their household dissolved entirely, their names struck from centuries of recorded history as the ultimate punishment within Vathari culture. Selvan herself faced her own reckoning for breaking the sacred boundaries of the Chorus bond, though the Council of Elders, who reviewed her actions, ultimately ruled that extending emergency protection to save a life, even one outside traditional bonds, represented an acceptable exception to ancient law, provided such extensions were never used carelessly or without genuine necessity. "They have created an entirely new category of law because of what I did," she told me one evening, as we walked together along the same observation deck where I had first learned about the loud, ever-present nature of her Chorus bond. "They are calling it emergency extension. I believe I am now the only Vathari in recorded history who has ever formed even a temporary bond with someone outside our own species." "How does that feel?" I asked. "Terrifying," she admitted, "and also correct, in a way I cannot fully explain. For the first time in my life, I extended myself towards someone and felt something return that was not performance, not obligation, not inherited purpose, simply truth." We had reached the same section of window where I had first watched her stare out at the stars, wrestling with questions neither of us had fully understood at the time. Now, weeks later, the view looked entirely different somehow, though the stars themselves had not changed at all. "The formal ratification ceremony has been rescheduled," she said, 3 days from now. "I intend to sign the alliance myself, in front of the full Concord, correcting the mistake I made when I first stood before them." "That's good," I said. "That's what all of this was building toward." "Yes," she agreed, "but I find myself wondering what happens after. Once the ceremony concludes, once the alliance is formally established, once my duties here are complete, what happens to this?" She gestured vaguely between us, and I understood exactly what she meant without needing further explanation. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm a soldier, Selvan. My orders are whatever the Concord decides they should be. If they send me back to human territory once the ceremony concludes, I'll go, because that's the job. And if they do not send you back," she said quietly, "if there were another path available, would you consider it?" I studied her for a long moment, this alien princess who had once stood before an entire galaxy and declared my species unworthy of trust, now standing before me, asking a question that had nothing to do with politics or alliances or centuries-old grudges between our peoples. "I'd consider it," I said, "if it meant staying near someone who taught me that strength isn't about certainty, it's about choosing to trust something even when every instinct you've ever known tells you not to." She smiled, then, fully and without hesitation, the first true smile I had ever seen from her in all our weeks together. 3 days later, the Concord Council convened once again in the Grand Chamber where this entire story had begun. Delegates from a dozen worlds gathered to witness what many were now calling one of the most significant diplomatic reversals in recent Concord history. Selvan stood upon the same raised platform where she had once rejected humanity so completely, her silver robes catching the light exactly as they had weeks before. But everything else about the moment felt entirely different now. "Weeks ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "I stood in this very place and told you that humanity was unready for alliance, unrefined, dangerous, built on conflict rather than wisdom. I have since learned that judgment was built upon a lie decades in the making, a lie constructed by those within my own house who feared losing power should true cooperation between our species ever take root." She paused, allowing her words to settle across the silent chamber. "But even beyond correcting that lie, I have learned something far more important during these recent weeks. I have learned that humanity's capacity for conflict exists alongside an equally powerful capacity for sacrifice, for restraint, for loyalty, that asks nothing in return. I have witnessed this not through reports or historical records, but through direct experience with one member of your species who has shown me, again and again, that strength and gentleness are not opposites. They are simply two expressions of the same courage. She turned toward where I stood near the chamber's edge, her golden eyes finding mine across the crowded assembly. I therefore formally ratify the alliance between the FaSci Dominion and the human worlds of the Concord, she declared, her voice rising with clear conviction. Not as a political necessity, but as a choice I make freely, having witnessed exactly what this alliance is capable of becoming. The chamber erupted into applause, delegates from a dozen worlds rising from their seats as the formal documents materialized before the assembly, awaiting only her signature to complete what had once seemed an impossible reversal. She signed the agreement with steady hands, the same hands that had once trembled while fleeing assassins through cramped maintenance shafts deep beneath the station. Ambassador Finch approached me afterward, his tired face finally showing genuine relief rather than the constant exhaustion I had grown accustomed to seeing. "You understand," he said, "that you have just witnessed the beginning of something far larger than either of us anticipated when this assignment started. Humanity's reputation across the Concord will never be the same after today." "I just did my job," I said. "Your job," he said, smiling slightly, was to stand quietly in the background and look intimidating. Everything else was simply who you chose to be when nobody required it of you. Later that evening, as the celebration continued throughout the station, Sel Vaughn found me standing alone on the observation deck, watching the same stars that had witnessed every difficult moment of the past weeks. "The Council has approved a permanent diplomatic liaison position," she said, joining me at the window. "A human representative to remain stationed within the Dominion Court, ensuring smooth cooperation between our peoples during this early period of the alliance." "That sounds like an important position," I said. "It is," she agreed. "I have already submitted a formal request that you be considered for it." I turned to look at her fully, understanding the weight of what she was offering, not simply a job, but a choice, freely made, about what kind of future both of us wanted to build from the wreckage of old lies and inherited fears. "I accept," I said simply. She smiled again, that same unguarded expression I had first seen only days before, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, simply standing together beneath a sky full of stars that belonged to neither of our species alone, but now, perhaps, belonged to both of us equally. 20 years ago," she said quietly, "a lie was born from fear, and it nearly cost two civilizations any chance of understanding each other. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that a single soldier's choice to act with compassion rather than indifference was enough to finally unravel that lie before it caused any further harm. I'm grateful too," I said, "that the first FaSci I ever truly came to know turned out to be someone brave enough to question everything she had been taught, the moment the truth demanded it of her." Below us, throughout the station, delegates from across the galaxy continued celebrating an alliance that had nearly failed to exist at all, unaware that its true beginning had not happened in any council chamber, but in a single quiet moment when one soldier chose to step between a blade and a stranger, simply because it was the right thing to do. And as the stars turned slowly overhead, marking the passage of a night that would be remembered across a dozen worlds for generations to come, I understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead for humanity's place among the stars, we would face them the same way this entire story had unfolded from its very first moment. Together, one honest choice at a time.